Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military of a Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 30th of June of 2025. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And during this video we're going to discuss several directions where the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly, and today we came to the conclusion that several defensive lines of the armed forces of Ukraine collapsed completely. So let's start, let's discuss everything in details, and first we're going to talk about the Sumy direction, where the Russians, according to pro-Russian resources, continue their offensive operation. But when talking about geolocations and everything that we receive from the line of combat contact, we see that the Russians stopped. Either the Russians stopped because they decided to do this, or the Ukrainians forced the Russians to stop due to high losses. As for now, it's very difficult to understand what the Russians are going to do next. One thing we know for sure, that until the Russians are able to turn the situation or to break the current situation, they will not continue their offensive operation. And the main difficulties of the Russians that the Russians faced is the drones, the significant number of drones that Ukrainians used to stop the Russian advances and their offensive. And during the previous 24 hours, the Russians published this video. And here we can see how the Russians managed to discover another concentration of Ukrainian forces. This is a former military base on the territory of the city by the name of Konotop. The Russians managed to discover not just significant number of Ukrainian vehicles in this area. As you can see, the Russians managed to discover another, let's say, factory or military facility that Ukrainians used to produce drones to attack deep inside of the territory of the Russian Federation and to attack Russian units and Russian forces that are currently trying to advance in the direction of the city of Sumy itself. And as a result of several ground strikes, this entire military base was probably set on fire. Several facilities were damaged and destroyed. This is very important video because this is not the first attack that was carried out by the Russians since the beginning of June. More precisely, during the previous months, the Russians published lots of videos and lots of articles about the city of Konotop. Several strikes were recorded in the area of airfield, several strikes were recorded in the residential area of the city of Konotop, and several strikes were recorded exactly in the area of this military base. So this video we have already discussed. This video was published today on the 30th of June, but several days ago, on the 18th of June of 2025, we got another video from the city of Konotop, and this is probably the first day when the Russians discovered the concentration of Ukrainian FPV drone, let's say, storage or something like this. And during the 18th of June, the Russians carry out first Iskander strike, and as a result of this Iskander strike, we can see very heavy explosion, and the Russians managed to destroy the first barrack on the first hangar that Ukrainians were used to produce drones or to combine them before sending them to the line of combat contact. So the Russians came to the conclusion that first of all they need to destroy as many as possible warehouses, ammo depots of the armed forces of Ukraine before they continue their offensive operation in the area of the city of Sumy. Because once again, during the previous 24 hours, we got another day without any changes on the ground. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Siversk direction. During the previous 24 hours, we got very interesting updates from this area. As you can see, we have adjusted the map, and we have adjusted the map based on the reports that were published by pro-Russian resources and based on the neutral reports that confirm basically pro-Russian resources. So this is the situation by the end of the 29th of June of 2025, and on the 29th of June we got first report that the fighters of the 7th Brigade have gained a foothold in the Serebryanka near the school and are advancing further. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions to the west of the settlement of Verkhnye Kamenskaya, and as a result of offensive, the Russians secured this water reservoir. So this report we got yesterday, and today this information was confirmed by neutral mappers. So according to them, indeed the Russians managed to improve their positions in the city of Serebryanka. So additional streets and buildings were taken by the Russians. Especially the Russians managed to secure this school and this facility, which is very important. Furthermore, the Russians continue bombing and attacking the city of Siversk itself and the village of Serebryanka with the purpose not to allow the Ukrainians to bring additional forces, and the Russians are trying to destroy as many as possible FPV drone operator bases and temporary deployment points, because as usually temporary deployment points and FPV drone operators is a huge headache for the Russian forces. So the battle continue. The Russians are saying that there are still lots of problems from the Serebryanka forest, because the Ukrainians understand that the village of Serebryanka is not just a regular village, it's a gates towards the city of Siversk, so that is why the Ukrainians are trying to counterattack the Russians from the north. So with the purpose to slow down the Russians and not to allow them to advance further. That is why the Russians were forced to begin another offensive operation in the area of Serebryanka forest with the purpose to distract essentially Ukrainian forces by attacking them from behind. So there are very heavy clashes right now, and the main purpose of the Russians, of course, to finish the battle for this small village. At the same time, according to many sources, the Russians managed to shorten the distance to the city of Siversk itself. And currently, if we calculate the distance between the possible Russian positions in the city of Serebryanka itself is already less than 1.7 kilometers, so it's already 1 mile. 1 mile to the city of Siversk, and furthermore, according to information we have and according to several pro-Russian resources, some groups of Russian sabotage and reconnaissance forces managed to enter the city of Siversk for several times during the previous days. So we can't say for sure that Ukrainians control currently the entire city. We believe that the eastern part and the northeastern part is already in the gray zone. So we are talking about this territory. We believe that the Russians have access to this territory, and maybe the Ukrainians have no control over this territory already, which means that the battle for the city of Siversk is going to may start in the very near future, and this is going to be a very huge media victory of the armed force of the Russian Federation. But obviously the Russians will begin their offensive operation in the direction of the city of Siversk after another 2-3 days in a row massive missile and drone strike. As for the previous night, we haven't recorded any of this. The last massive missile strike took place yesterday, so we are waiting for another massive missile and drone strike that most likely is going to happen during this week. Now let's talk about the Kostyantynivka direction. As we discussed in the previous video, the main clashes are taking place for the villages of Yablunovka and Alexander Kalinova. During the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians sent a lot of reinforcements and reserves with the purpose to stabilize the situation, but due to the fact that the Russians control the main lines, the main streets, and both the villages of Yablunovka and Alexander Kalinova, the Ukrainians just during the redeployment process suffered huge losses. The main attempt, the main purpose of Ukrainian counterattacks is to unblock the western roads and 20 road with the purpose to allow the Ukrainians from the Sherbinovka, Novospaska, Katerinovka, Klibank, big pockets to evacuate themselves and to save as many as possible soldiers. But once again, Ukrainian attacks were repelled. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions a bit along M32 road. In this video, we can see how Ukrainians were attacking Russians in this area, and one of the episodes was geolocated exactly in this point. Based on this video, we came to the conclusion that the Russians managed to secure this stronghold and to answer another stronghold, the next stronghold along M32 road in the direction of the city of Kostyantynivka. So, for example, this is the situation by the end of the 29th of June of 2025, and this is the situation by the end of the 30th of June. Yes, the progress is not so fast, the Russians are moving very slowly, but the most important is that the Russians are moving, and I believe that we can start counting days for the villages of Yablunovka and Alexandra Kalinova. Now let's move further. And as for the Pokrovsk agglomeration, during the previous 24 hours, as we discussed in the previous video, the Russians managed to break through Ukrainian defensive line in this area and to enter the settlements of Novotoretska. From the southeast, the Russians managed to enter the village of Razino from the east, according to pro-Russian and neutral mappers, and the Russians managed to enter the northeastern part of Novoekonomichne. And during the previous 24 hours, during the previous day, we were waiting whether the Russians are going to confirm this information with some videos or geolocations, but by the end of the 30th of June of 2025, we haven't received anything that can confirm Russian control over any of these settlements or any parts of these settlements, which is very important because if this information is being confirmed, this is going to be the beginning of complete collapse of Ukrainian defensive line in the area of the Pokrovsk agglomeration. Furthermore, several mappers reported that the Russians improved their position significantly to the south of the city of Pokrovsk. Several mappers reported that the Russians secured the village of Zverova, so this part, and the Russians managed to enter the village of Novoukrainka. So both villages are under complete Russian control, and the distances to the city of Pokrovsk are minimal from this direction. Now let's discuss the situation in the South Donetsk direction, where, according to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. Basically, at the beginning of this video, I told you that we believe that one of the front lines, one of the defensive line of the armored forces of Ukraine has collapsed completely. And we believe that this is exactly the direction. Because during the past 24 hours, we got lots of very interesting changes on the ground, especially very interesting changes were provided us by the neutral and pro-Ukrainian sources. So let's discuss them in details. And this is the first adjustment of the map that was published by pro-Ukrainian resources. As you can see, they have colored a small pocket of Russian progress to the south of the village of Zirka, and the Ukrainians are saying that the Russians managed to get to the river of Mokre Yali and to establish complete control over these three lines. I would like to remind you that several days ago, the Minister of Defense, both the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, confirmed control over Zirka, and we got several geolocations with Russian flags along the entire village. But for some reason, the Ukrainians refused to color this territory under complete Russian control. But it is not very important, it doesn't matter, because pro-Ukrainian resources show us very interesting gray zone in the area of the village of Piddubne. So as you can see, huge pockets from the river of Mokre Yali in the direction of the village itself. If we turn back to the map, the Ukrainians are saying that somehow the Russians managed to cross the river of Mokre Yali and to establish complete control over this pocket, over this territory. Obviously, this is something unbelievable, telling the truth. I'm not sure how exactly this happened, but this is very interesting. So according to pro-Ukrainian resources, the Russians, after the fall of the village of Zirka, continue advancing further in the southwestern direction, crossed the river of Mokre Yali, entered the central part of Piddubne, and now the Russians are encircled in this area, and the Russians are trying to repel upcoming Ukrainian attacks that are currently taking place. This is very important offensive, because if this information is correct and if the Russians are able to repel every single upcoming Ukrainian attack, then the village of Mirne would be caught in cauldron by the Russians, because this is the only road that Ukrainians have to supply and support their forces. This is the road I'm talking about. And now, due to the progress on the ground that was shown by pro-Ukrainian mappers, we see that the village of Mirne is currently without any supply and support from the mainland. The Russians are bombing and attacking this settlement heavily, and the main reason of these bombardments is to pin down the Ukrainians and not to allow these units to escape the settlement, with the purpose to attack the village of Piddubne, with the purpose to restore control over the settlement. At the same time, several sources reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Russians from the village of Piddubne managed to improve their positions and to reach the outskirts of the settlement of Mirne. So we believe that these upcoming nights, between the 30th of June and the 1st of July of 2025, the Russians will make first attempts to attack the settlement itself, with the purpose to answer the settlement and to force the Ukrainians to fall back, most likely in the western direction towards these three lines, towards the settlement of Alexandragrad, because the Ukrainians have no possibilities to move in the northern direction. At the same time, we believe that Ukrainians are going to counterattack the Russians in Piddubne with the purpose to restore control over the settlement, and most likely these counterattacks are going to take place also this upcoming night. So the situation is very tense and remains tense, obviously, and now it's important who is going to be faster. Either the Russians are going to be faster with the battle for Mirne, or the Ukrainians are faster with the battle for the settlement of Piddubne and the unblocking of Ukrainians in this settlement. The Russians are trying to do everything they can with the purpose not to allow the Ukrainians to be successful. For example, today we got reports that the Russians managed to damage and almost destroy the bridge in the area of Andriivka-Klivtsova. So this very important logistic road was damaged and destroyed by the Russians, and as you can see, now the Ukrainians have less possibilities to bring forces along an A15 road in the direction of Piddubne. So these roads, the Ukrainians have possibilities, but obviously their logistic capabilities were lowered significantly, and most likely the Russians will continue attacking this bridge with the purpose to destroy the bridge completely. This will allow the Russians, this will increase the chances of the armored forces of the Russian Federation to hold the positions in the village of Piddubne for much longer period of time. At the same time, the Russian forces continue advancing to the south of the village of Mirne, from the village of Kamar and Fyodorovka in the direction of the settlement of Voskresenka. There are very heavy clashes, and the main purpose of this attack not to allow the Ukrainians to bring additional forces through the fields in the direction of the same settlement by the name of Mirne and Piddubne from the southwest. The Russians are bombing and attacking the settlement of Voskresenka, trying to pin down the Ukrainians as well, and to prepare the settlement also before another major offensive and probably assault operation. The Russians published another very interesting adjustment was published by pro-Ukrainian sources during the previous 24 hours, and we're talking about this map. According to this map, the Russians improved their positions to the north of the settlement of Shevchenka, and there is another pocket, another corridor from the settlement of Shevchenka to the southeastern part of Voskresenka. So the Ukrainians are trying to tell us that the Russians during the previous 24 hours, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over these farms in the southeastern part of Voskresenka. So here we can see the same situation as we can see in the village of Piddubne. The Russians advanced, digged in deeper, and cut supply and support lines for the village of Mirne and to this pocket from this area as well. And now the Ukrainians also need to counterattack these southeastern farms with the purpose to restore logistics. So this upcoming night is going to be very interesting and vital for this entire direction. Because if Ukrainians lose the battle for Piddubne, if Ukrainians lose the battle for the southeastern part of Voskresenka and for these supply lines, very likely that during the next week the Russians will be able to establish complete control over this entire territory. And we are talking about the villages of Piddubne, Mirne, Voskresenka and Malinovka itself. And if this happens, this is going to be probably the biggest progress since the beginning of the special military operation. Let's say since the end of 2022, because the Russians are advancing here very fast. The Russians spent up to 5 days to take Zaporizhzhia, 3 days to take Yalta, 1 day to take Zirka, and now we see that the Russians are able to establish control over 4 villages in this area, probably for another week, which is very fast. And this speed and this rate of Russian offensive tell us that most likely Ukrainian defensive line in this area has collapsed completely, without any possibilities to restore its functionality. Furthermore, we see that the Russians are moving in the direction of the village of Mikhailovka. This is very important village because this is one of the biggest villages in this, let's say, area. The rest of the villages are very small, and these small, let's say, villages don't allow the Russians to concentrate their units. And to continue offensive, first of all, you need a place where you can concentrate your forces up to 1, 2 or 3 brigades, and then you can use these brigades for further offensive. Because all these villages can allow you to concentrate probably maybe platoons, maybe battalions, but not brigades. You can't continue offensive without on the battalion level. You need to continue offensive either on the brigade level or in the division level. So that is why the Russians need the settlement. This will allow them to continue offensive operation further in the direction of the settlement of Pokrovsk, because the settlement of Pokrovsk is bigger than the village of Velika Mikhailovka, and on this, let's say, level, the Russians would be able to concentrate units on the level of several brigades, and obviously this is going to be very powerful forces to attack the city of Gulyai-Polye from the north, for example, or to move forward in the northwestern direction. So we believe that there is a breakthrough exactly in this area. Now let's discuss the situation in the Zaporizhzhia direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation, the settlement of, let's say, Kamenskaya. Today we have changes on the ground, and today lots of very reliable pro-Russian resources stated that most likely to this upcoming night or tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, but obviously during this week, the Russians will secure the village of Kamenskaya completely, and the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back. And this is a very interesting situation, because most likely the Russians are not going to stop. After the settlement of Kamenskaya, the Russians will continue further in the direction of Plavny and then in the direction of the settlement of Stepnogorsk. So if Russians are able to secure all these territories, then the Russians will be able to start using drones on fiber optic to attack the city of Zaporizhzhia itself, and this can lead to unpredictable consequences regarding Ukrainian logistics. We have changes. We have video published by the Ukrainian side where we can see how Ukrainians were attacking Russians in the southern part of Kamenskaya, and based on this video we came to the conclusion that at least the southern part of the settlement is already under complete Russian control. Once again, several pro-Russian resources reported that these days the northern part will be taken by the Russians as well. So this is, for example, the situation by the end of the 29th of June. Most of these territories used to be considered as a gray zone or contested area, and now we have enough of proofs to color the southern part completely. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.